And so one of the reasons that thinking about the complexity of these thermal response curves beyond just linear responses, which can actually, as you've seen already in some of the videos you've already watched, sometimes those linear effects can do a really good job of approximating, but that's not always the case. And one of the examples where those sort of simple approximations and using averages falls a little bit short is if we think about what happens under variable conditions. So what I'm going to introduce here is something called, referred to as Jensen's inequality. And we're going to start just sort of walking through an example of this. So if we think of a thermal response curve here, again, it doesn't really matter what aspect of performance you're looking at, but imagine this can be locomotion, survival, really whatever you want it to be. But we think about an organism that is always at its thermal optimum. Right, so it's spending all of its time right at that, in this case, about 30 degrees Celsius. But if we contrast that case to a case where, say, you have an organism that is spending half of its time at 25 degrees and half of its time at 35 degrees. So 5 degrees below or above its thermal optimum. Right? The average there is actually the same. The average is still 30 degrees Celsius, say, but it's actually spending all of its time either at 25 or 35 degrees Celsius. And so if you take the average performance of that shown here in these lines sort of crossing the top of that peak, the performance is actually going to be lower than you would anticipate or you would predict from the average. So that is just to highlight that when you think about variation, sometimes just those averages, when you have a nonlinear response, so a curvy response, averages can actually hide a lot of what the real effects would be. And the degree to which an average hides those effects actually depends on how sort of generalist the species responses are. So for example, if we compare a curve like this that is a bit flatter and maybe more of a generalist to a species that might be more of a thermal specialist, that same difference, so looking at, an organism that is always getting to exist at 30 degrees C versus spending half its time at 25 and 35 degrees C, you actually can expect really dramatic declines in predicted performance just by that simple averaging. So the overall takeaway of Jensen's inequality is that when we have nonlinear or curvy responses, averages of conditions don't actually predict performance.